It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear.
So? Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to Science on Top, episode 213 for Sunday, the 7th of February, 2016. My name's Ed Brown and joining me is Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And medical entomologist from the University of Sydney, Dr. Cameron Webb. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. And as I said, you're a medical entomologist and you really specialise in mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases. So let's start off with the big news that everyone's talking about. Can you tell us basically what Zika is?
Yeah, so Zika is a mosquito-borne virus that we've known about for about 70 years. So originally discovered from Uganda back in the 40s. And sort of since then it spread quite widely throughout Africa and Asia, and nobody really worried about it too much. It really flew under the sort of public health radar. And one of the reasons for that is that when people are infected with it, you get a very mild disease. So fever, rash, muscle or joint pain, a bit of red eyes from time to time. And compared to some of the other mosquito-borne viruses that are circulating in that region, particularly dengue and in later years chikungunya virus, and notwithstanding the activity of malaria in those regions, nobody really worried too much about Zika, but it's the emergence, I guess, in the Pacific in the last few years, and then now in the last 18 months or so in the Americas that has sort of really brought it to the attention of public health authorities across the world. And
so, as you say, it's fairly mild symptoms. Is it true that a lot of people don't even know they've got it?
Yeah, that's true. We suspect there's only about 1 in 5 people infected with the virus actually develop symptoms. So, and even those that do develop the symptoms, if it's a fairly mild illness, you may not suspect you even have a mosquito-borne virus.
It's a common cold or something, really. Like a lot of those symptoms are very similar to...
Yeah, headache and fever is just feeling a bit lousy. Maybe I've got the flu or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the same thing applies to a lot of these mosquito-borne viruses as well. And, a great example locally is Ross River virus, which is, again, another one of these viruses spread by mosquitoes locally. But the illness can be really mild, and a lot of people won't even bother going to the doctor. And even if you do go to the doctor, you don't have the blood test to confirm infection. And so even though for something like Ross River virus that's a notifiable disease in Australia, the official statistics are really only the tip of the iceberg. So they probably only represent the more severe cases of illness and don't really give a good indication of just how many people are exposed to these pathogens every year.
But there's a reason that it's in the news now, really, and it's not just the fever and headaches. It's this microcephaly, these unusually small heads resulting and brain deformities from babies born from infected mothers. But this isn't a proven link. It's more of a correlation. Is that right?
Yeah, it seems to be the case. It's a little bit more than that, in the sense that they've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the incidence of microcephaly, particularly in parts of Brazil. And it's overlapping in areas where there's a lot of Zika virus activity. And they know from, I must admit, some relatively small numbers that the mums have been who've given birth to these microcephaly cases, that the kids with the birth defects have been infected with the virus. The babies have tested positive for it as well. But I guess really this uncertainty about the link between Zika virus and the birth defects is really one of the reasons why the WHO announced this significant public health emergency last week, because it sort of frees up some more resources to investigate this. Look, the problem with some of these widespread mosquito-borne pathogens is that a lot of people in the community would test positive for it if you went and looked for it. So, maybe it's just a coincidence that some of these people who've experienced this are just, just part of the wider community that's exposed to this virus when it's circulating, as it has in the last year or so.
But it is, as you say, a very sharp rise. I mean, do you know how many cases of microcephaly there have been recently linked to this?
Yeah, well, I think well over 4,000, and I think sort of approaching 5,000. And it's a dramatic increase in what it was previously. And there's been various explanations for that, because microcephaly is, I'm not an expert necessarily in microcephaly, but there's a whole range of factors that can contribute to that. And there's also been the suggestion that there's, once people were aware of this problem, they started investigating it. And so there's probably much greater reporting of it as well, which sort of clouds the issue even more. And again, there just seems to be more unanswered questions than we sort of understand at the moment about this, and that's it's both worrying but also sort of perplexing, I guess, at the same time.
What about the advice from El Salvador not to get pregnant? I mean, that seems like a very unrealistic way to cope,
and also extremely sort of
prejudicial.
Also, sort of very, very hot-headed, I suppose.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, that advice was. It really took us all by surprise. I guess making those sort of. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it's an abundance of caution that everybody's expressing here until we really know what's going on. To avoid pregnancy for that period of time, you would think that sort of advice is going to be revised once we have a better indication of what's happening, because it's not just the fact that those sort of pregnant are exposed to the virus, which may lead to birth defects, but we don't know at what stage of pregnancy. Is it early on? Is it late on? If a woman is exposed to the virus, for how long do they have to wait before trying to fall pregnant? You would expect that it would only be when those initial phases of infection, when the pregnant woman is viremic, that there's going to be a transfer to the unborn child. But all of these really practical questions that people are asking, we don't know the answers to, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are being so cautious and so concerned about this.
Do you know how they made that link in the first place? Or was it just looking at the rise of microcephaly and looking at the rise of Zika and making and putting, connecting the dots? Or was it just, it just seems to me a fairly, almost like a random kind of association.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that people were investigating, or somebody noticed a bit of a cluster of cases of microcephaly, started investigating it. And of course, at the time, there was already talk about Zika virus circulating, because, it was only in the last year or so that the first cases were ever recorded from the Americas. And so people were aware of this new pathogen circulating, and maybe that sort of put it on the radar as well of people to suspect if something new is happening in the public health sphere, then maybe it's got to do with this pathogen that all of a sudden has popped up in the region.
But also, is it true that there's only one species of mosquito that carries Zika out of more than 300 species of mosquito? Is that correct?
Yeah, no. Well, there's really only one that we're worried about, but there's a small group of mosquitoes that have been identified as either playing a role in transmission or suspected to be playing a role in transmission. But most of those species that are listed are either mosquitoes that are found in Africa or a couple of species in the Pacific. So in terms of Australia, Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito, is the one that is suspected to be driving the outbreak. And it's really the mosquito that drives outbreaks of a whole range of mosquito-borne disease across the tropics. And even it gets a little bit complicated when you start talking about the mosquitoes and their role in outbreaks of disease, because mosquitoes vary in their ability to transmit different pathogens. And so, they're not like sort of little dirty syringes transferring droplets of blood from person to person. There's a relationship between the pathogen and the mosquito. And some mosquitoes are really great at transmitting some viruses, but other mosquitoes are pretty hopeless and are very specific. And one of the reasons why, I'm sure if we grabbed dozens of mosquitoes and tested them in the laboratory, we might find that some of them can transmit the virus. But in the real world, one of the reasons why the yellow fever mosquito is such a concern is that it's sort of given up its normal habitat in forests and jungles and moved into the cities. So it breeds in water holding containers like pot plant sources and drains and buckets of water and any kind of rubbish or refuse that holds water. They'll lay their eggs in and complete their development there. So they're living quite close to human habitation. But then the other thing is that they preferentially feed on humans, and what that means is that they're really fantastic at transmitting these pathogens from human to human. A lot of the other mosquitoes are more general in their preferences for blood, and so, again, looking at Ross River virus and the mosquitoes that transmit that in Australia, they're just as likely to bite a bird or a kangaroo or a dog or a cow as they are a person, and so the virus isn't as concentrated the transmission of the virus isn't as concentrated amongst the human population.
Gotcha. So it's just that these particular species of mosquitoes that are carrying this are more likely to bite humans than other animals, and that's why they're the main carriers.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a couple of other kind of subtle changes to their biology that makes them even better vectors of pathogens. And probably the most important of that is that they like to take a whole series of small blood meals rather than one big blood meal at a time. So whereas most mosquitoes will get a blood meal, and as you probably know, it's only the female mosquito that bites. She needs the blood to develop her eggs. And given the chance, most mosquitoes will just get a gutful of blood if they get the chance and fly off and develop their eggs. But the yellow fever mosquito tends to like to take lots of little small blood meals. And so what that means is that if a mosquito is infected with something like Zika virus, it has the capacity to infect a lot more people than many other mosquitoes. So it's like their infection strike rate is quite high.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. And while we're talking about transmission, of course, there's this new phenomenon that I've only heard about since Zika has been a discussion of baggage Zika and baggage dengue, baggage malaria. Can you tell us what this is? This is intriguing.
Yeah, there's always these strange cases that pop up every year of someone coming down with one of these mosquito-borne viruses that are not in an area of the world where the mosquitoes are present. And there's a couple of things that contribute to Zika transmission, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But one of the really interesting ones is sort of this baggage mosquito-borne disease. And this is going to sound completely illogical and crazy, but it seems to be reported reasonably regularly. And what essentially it means is that a mosquito infected with a pathogen, whether it be a malaria parasite or a mosquito-borne virus, basically gets packed away with your luggage. When you're packing up in your hotel room, when you get ready to go home, you go out to the airport, you load on your bag on the plane, you come home, you get the taxi home, and then you unpack your bag, the mosquito flies out and bites your housemate or your wife.
How long's the mosquito's lifespan, though? Will it last? And will it last like the depressurization of a cabin and all the rest of it?
Well, yeah, this is the really interesting thing. So mosquitoes only last 3 weeks. They only live about 3 weeks. But when you think about it, every corner of the world is pretty much only about 24 hours away these days with international travel. But the other thing is you imagine your suitcase and you've got all your clothes kind of thrown in at the end of the holiday, and a mosquito is kind of in a little crevice in between a whole lot of these. There's quite a lot of insulation between where the mosquito is and the sort of the environments that might otherwise be influencing it. And we see there's been like a few weird cases. Like there was a case of dengue a few years ago of a tourist, I think, in Germany, and the suspicion was that somebody traveling from Japan to a backpacker hostel in Europe somewhere kind of unpacked their bag and infected someone. But even in Australia, last year we had the first case of locally acquired dengue virus in Western Australia for 70 years, and there's no other explanation that anybody can identify that explains this gentleman's infection other than one of his neighbours has come back from Bali and mosquitoes have flown out and bitten him.
I've just got this mental image of this angry mosquito flying out after 24 hours on a plane. It's jet-lagged, it's angry, and it's just biting everyone.
So, that being said...
Sorry, Cameron.
No, I was just going to say, I would be angry myself too if I was locked away in a suitcase for 10 hours or something like that.
Most of us are. It's called economy travel.
Yeah, that's right. But we also get, so this kind of leads into these sort of some really unusual kind of cases. And, we also have a phenomenon known as airport mosquito-borne disease. And most of the cases reported have been airport malaria. But it's almost the same situation where a mosquito has got into the luggage compartment of a plane somehow or other. The plane lands at a new destination, the mosquito flies out and it bites someone who lives near the airport. And there's been a couple of cases like that. There's been a case of, I think it was dengue virus infection near the airport in Darwin a few years ago. And so, these strange things can happen.
And there was also isn't there a recent case where someone seems to have acquired it through sexual contact?
Yeah, that's right. Look, 5 years ago, I would have... About the only reason I would have included Zika virus in one of my medical entomology lectures was because of a really famous case in I think it was 2007, where there was some entomologists that were in Africa doing field work, and they came home to Colorado in the middle of winter, I think it was, and one of the entomologists' wife started getting sick, and turned out he brought her home Zika virus, and there was no other. I mean, I must admit, for a while, I always sort of suspected that it could have been a case of baggage Zika, but it's sort of been reasonably well studied, and now we know that Zika virus can be detected in semen, saliva, and urine, and so this is a potential route of transmission. And just in the last week, we've had what has been suspected to be sexual transmission of Zika virus in Texas.
But I guess that's another thing that we don't know. I mean, it's merely by eliminating things like, was he bitten and then a mosquito bit someone else to transfer. The only possible explanation would be sexual or baggage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right.
You're sort of guessing in a process of elimination.
Well, I mean, Occam's razor. Like, if you find it in sexual fluids, it's a fairly logical assumption to make that it's transmissible via sex.
I guess the thing is that what we don't know is, if you like, just because the virus is present there, of course, whether that means that that's a route of transmission, like whether you're exposed to those fluids, what the likelihood is of your partner, being infected with the virus. That's some of the things that's never really been, studied. And it's one of the, because of this sort of famous Zika case, every now and again we kind of, when entomologists get together and talking about ways in which you spread virus around, we often kind of talked about, like, why was there never really any indication that any other mosquito-borne virus was transmitted in this way? And one of the possible explanations for that is that in the vast majority of cases, people may not even think to consider that route of transmission, because if people are living in an area where the mosquitoes are present, nobody will ever really consider anything other than mosquito bite as the route of transmission. And so, maybe there are these incidents that just don't ever get investigated or even suspected there's something other than a mosquito bite at play there.
Importance of keeping an open mind, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the best prevention method then again? Is it just a matter of mosquito nets and mosquito repellents and that? Or
look, at the moment, that's really all that we have at our disposal. There's no vaccine. And so, the advice is to avoid mosquito bites, which is always easier said than done.
Yeah, geez, you can't even avoid them in a country like Australia, like down south, own tropical country.
That's right. And I think that one of the problems is that mosquito repellents are relatively cheap and very effective, but the problem is that it relies on people to use them correctly, and that's sort of where they fall down in terms of bite prevention, because health authorities are really great at recommending a list of products to use, but they're not very good at providing advice on how they use them. And so unless you're applying a nice even coat on all exposed areas of skin, mosquito, a dab here or there is not going to work. And if you miss a gap, in the same way that if you miss a gap when you're putting on sunscreen and you get sunburn in this, strange shapes on your back or shoulders or whatever, mosquitoes will find a way through and bite you. And
really?
When I was in Sri Lanka, I was bitten through a T-shirt. It didn't matter. It was insane.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
light, sort of light cotton T-shirts and stuff like that. Mosquitoes are always trying to bite me through my shirt when I'm out in the wetlands. It happens all the time. The other thing too, which particularly for Australian travellers, and I strongly suspect this is one of the reasons why we're seeing a steady increase in the amount of dengue cases coming back into Australia with travellers, particularly going to Indonesia, Bali in particular, I suppose, is that the mosquitoes that transmit these viruses bite during the day, not in the afternoon. And a species like Aedes aegypti, they bite during the day. So for a start, you really should be putting repellent on when you get out of bed in the morning. And I suspect that maybe a lot of people who come down with dengue are bitten while they're having breakfast and not, the afternoon barbecue, which is one thing.
Wow.
And there's also this sort of idea that mosquitoes bite at dusk.
At night, yeah.
Don't about it too much.
Well, that's the advice that we've grown up with, which is that's correct for Australia, because most of the mosquitoes are most active at dusk, a little bit at dawn, but generally not during the day unless there's a lot of them. Whereas these mosquitoes are biting throughout the day. And so again, a great example of this was when, you might remember the Commonwealth Games when they were in India a few years ago. There was an outbreak of dengue, and there are all these pictures in the press about our athletes like sleeping under bed nets and things like that, which sleeping under a bed net is not going to stop you from getting dengue because they're biting you during the day. And it's the way in which you kind of we really need to have some good, clear messages about this different type of sort of mosquito bite avoidance you need when you're in the tropics as opposed to sort of more temperate regions of Australia.
And you mentioned the products that we can apply. What are the main repellents that we should be using? Are there some that we should avoid and some that are better and more effective?
Yeah, I guess that in terms of avoiding things, I think that probably the best thing to do is buy your mosquito repellent and take it with you before you travel. And this is irrespective of the current Zika outbreak, really any travel to tropical regions, because all mosquito repellents that are sold in Australia have to be registered by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority that check products for efficacy and safety. You don't really know what you're going to be getting in the corner store in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I am sure in some parts of Brazil you would not be able to find any mosquito repellent if you just turned up. And we know that there's been a recent outbreak of dengue in Hawaii, and the stores are selling out of product, so you can never guarantee you're getting it. But the products that really work the best are diethyltoluamide, which is commonly called DEET, and also a product called picaridin, and they're the two most widespread mosquito repellents you'll find. And so even though you might be faced with a huge range of formulations in your supermarket or pharmacy, they all really contain one of those two products, and they provide the longest lasting protection. They're used by billions of people all around the world every year. We see very few adverse health effects of using the repellent alone, particularly if it's used as recommended. And that's really going to provide the best protection. So, I guess the one point that, and again, health authorities aren't really great at, educating people about is that you'll often find sort of tropical strength repellent or kid-friendly, low irritant type repellent, and they all vary in the concentration of, say, DEET that they have. And the concentration of DEET doesn't determine how many mosquitoes it keeps away; it determines how long it lasts. And so, if you use like a 10%, if you're comparing, say, a 10% and an 80% DEET-based repellent, they'll both provide the same level of protection for a couple of hours. But the 80% repellent I can get to last for about 15 hours in the lab, and the 10% will stop working after about 3 or 4 hours. And so then it comes down to understanding how often you've got to reapply things and stuff like that. But I guess the take home from that is that for people who often complain about not liking the smell of DEET or the repellents, if you're only outdoors for an hour, like if you're doing the gardening or you're hanging the clothes out or you're just in the afternoon and having a barbecue, you don't need to put on super duper kind of tropical strength formulations. Just a lower dose product should provide adequate protection.
A lower dose, but make sure you cover everything.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Wow.
Well, I mean, I tend to find that they go for, I don't know, maybe this is me, but they tend to go for like joints and things like that. Is that, in general, is that like a thing, or am I just imagining it? Because I tend to find that when I'm attacked by mosquitoes, they go for like wrist areas and the ankle area especially.
Yeah. Look, it's hard to know. We know that mosquitoes like to bite some people more than others, and it has to do with the sort of smell of our skin, in short. And there's some suggestion that the distribution of the bacteria and chemical compounds that create these smells aren't even across all of our skin, and so there's the suggestion that maybe there are localized areas that mosquitoes like to bite. I mean, I noticed that when I'm doing mosquito repellent tests and things like that, although I sort of put that down more to the distribution of hair on my arm more than anything else. But, it's highly likely. And also notwithstanding the fact that, those joints are probably areas where you're rubbing off mosquito repellent if you put it on anyway.
And some people seem to get bitten all the time and some people don't. Is it also maybe that there's either a genetic component or a dietary component? I think it's apocryphal, but some people say vitamin B keeps them away if you have lots of Barocca or something. Yeah,
look, there's no evidence to suggest that anything that you eat or drink can stop you getting bitten by mosquitoes. And, I often think that if there was, the shelves of our supermarkets would be full of mosquito repellent tablets.
Absolutely.
That's probably the strongest, the strongest reasoning behind there not being any truth to that, because, all the armies in the world are, there's a long history of our military forces all over the world being stricken by mosquito-borne disease, and particularly up until the 50s, in the US military, more personnel died because of vector-borne disease than by hand-to-hand combat kind of thing. So, the military would be dishing out these tablets as well. So,
I guarantee you can go to a homeopath or a naturopath and get something to take, but I don't think it'll work.
I've got little doubt, and there are people who swear by taking vitamin B, but there's no evidence to support that. Look, diet probably does, for the individual, it might make a little bit of difference every now and again. There's occasionally you see studies where, most famously, there's a study that showed that drinking beer made you more attractive to the mosquitoes that transmit malaria.
Is that just because everyone drinks beer at a barbecue outside?
Well, I kind of put forward the argument the more beer you drink, the less likely you are to remember to put on mosquito repellent.
That's true.
Maybe that explains it. But this was a study that was done in it was done in Africa somewhere, and basically they had two groups of volunteers, and one were given a couple of schooners of beer and the other one water. And then they released mosquitoes kind of in a couple of tubes and saw where they travelled to, and they were a bit more attracted to the beer drinkers. But, exactly what it is that's attracting the mosquitoes, we still don't really know. Do you sweat a bit more? Does your body temperature go up when you're having alcohol? Is it changing that sort of the smell of your skin? Who knows? But, at the end of the day, the people who weren't drinking beer weren't immune to mosquito bites either. So it's sort of, I often get frustrated with these sort of studies in a sense, because I kind of think if you put as much effort into choosing and using a mosquito repellent that worked, rather than thinking about why mosquitoes bite your friends more than you'd probably you would avoid the bites.
Fair point. Well, the other thing that everyone talks about is eradication, and I know there's this conspiracy theory that it's the genetically modified mosquitoes that have been released that's causing Zika or something like that.
No, really?
Oh yeah.
Oh, really?
I haven't come across that one.
But we do know mosquitoes carry Zika, malaria, dengue fever, chikungunya, all a heap of illnesses. And there are steps being undertaken, I guess you'd say, to cull mosquitoes, like, as I say, genetically modifying them to make them sterile. I guess the question is, do they actually do any good? Are mosquitoes good for anything? If we completely eradicate them, are we going to miss mosquitoes, really?
The thing is, there are reports. A few I think ecologists are kind of on the fence about this. Some ecologists say, no, we could probably get rid of mosquitoes and other things would replace them in food webs. But it's true that in some food webs, they are basically a huge component. So if you remove them, you probably disrupt a whole lot of things downstream.
Can we just remove the ones that bite humans?
Given the amount of things that we've extincted by accident,
I
don't know, maybe doing one on purpose wouldn't be that bad. Is that a really terrible way of thinking about it?
Look, I don't think it's such a bad way to think about it. There's a whole bunch of issues tied up in this idea about, eradicating mosquitoes. And, make no mistake, people have been trying to eradicate mosquitoes ever since they started draining swamps and, dumping insecticide all over the environment. So this is not something
It's always
new.
turned out super well.
yeah, that's exactly right. Look, I guess there's a couple of issues here, and the first one is, what good do mosquitoes do? And it might surprise you to know that that's not been a big area of of research amongst scientists for the past few hundred years. We've mostly been interested in working out why they spread disease and working out better ways to kill them rather than what their ecological role is. But it's always nagged me, and we've done some work in recent years just trying to get a handle on what role they do play, and it has a very practical application because as we've got better and better with some of our mosquito control products, we're finding that these products are far less likely to have any direct non-target impact on the environment. So some of the products that we apply to our coastal wetlands in Australia have virtually no non-target impacts. They're so specific to mosquitoes. And so some of the other local authorities are now starting to sort of ask the question, well, what is the indirect impact of just reducing mosquito populations by, anywhere from sort of 70 to 80%, which can sometimes happen with our broad-scale mosquito control programs. So one group of animals that we know eat mosquitoes are microbats. And so these are tiny insectivorous bats, which are quite different to the flying foxes that most people think when you use the term bat. Yeah. These are like tiny bats which fit into the palm of your hand, and they predominantly eat insects. And you can record activity of these bats because you basically record their sounds that they make, and they make different types of sounds, whether they're navigating or if they're hunting food. And so, bat ecologists have recorded these microbats feeding over mosquito habitats for many years, and the assumption was always made that they must have been eating mosquitoes. And so we had I had a PhD student, Leroy Gonsalves, who was supported by an environmental trust grant here in New South Wales. He was at the Australian Catholic University, and we kind of really wanted to just nail down how important, particularly our coastal salt marsh mosquitoes, were in the diet of these bats. And we started off doing the old school feeding kind of studies where we just collected bat poo and looked for bits of insects in there. And I can tell you that you can tell there's bits of insect in there, but there's no way in the world I could work out what they were, let alone what species of mosquito it was. And we got a bit frustrated, but Leroy was pretty great because he came up with the idea of instead of looking for bits of mosquito, let's look for mosquito DNA. And so we processed a whole bunch of bat poo for moth and mosquito DNA. And what we found was that every single microbat that we collected was eating moths, but only about half of the smallest of the bats were eating mosquitoes. And so we sort of came to the conclusion that mosquitoes weren't a staple in the diet of these bats, but they were more a snack food. And so the bats probably, in the long term, they probably don't rely on mosquitoes to sort of for survivorship. But, there's a possibility that just because they're such an abundant food source on occasion, they might be really important for the bats when they're raising young, for instance, or maybe they're really important for shorebirds that are sort of feeding themselves up before they migrate north for the winter and things like that. So there might be different stages of animals' life cycles where mosquitoes might be important. So, I don't want to sign off on the eradication of some of these wetland mosquitoes that are a potential food source.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but I think that it's Penny raised an important sort of point here, though, is that eradication of all mosquitoes there's little doubt that's a bad idea. But if you compare, that ecological role that those wetland mosquitoes play to a mosquito like the yellow fever mosquito that's driving this outbreak of Zika at the moment, I would argue that its ecological role is actually quite small for a couple of reasons. For a start, they're generally not very abundant mosquitoes. Like there's not a huge density of those mosquitoes when they're around. their populations are nothing compared to some of these sort of wetland species. And the other thing is that they're found in these completely artificial containers, and they're probably not contributing anything much to the aquatic ecosystem, certainly not the same way a mosquito would be if it was found in a natural habitat. And I doubt they're playing any significant role either as a food source, except for maybe a few spiders. They're probably not playing much of a role in pollination of plants, and if they are, the plants are probably just weeds anyway. And given the incredible burden of disease caused by dengue, chikungunya virus, and now Zika virus, I think I'd be really willing to gamble what might be a fairly minimal ecological impact associated with their eradication to what would be no doubt a significant reduction in the burden of disease internationally.
Yep, you've convinced me. They're useless scrum.
I suppose the next question is, I don't know much about insect eradication. Would there be an easy way to target just those species?
Yeah, I think no, but I think I think we're on the cusp of it though, and I think that genetic modification probably gives us that tool. I mean, at the end of the day, we're already seeing resistance to some of the commonly used insecticides used for mosquito control, and so unless there's a new generation of insecticides becoming available, we basically can't spray them to eradication. It's not going to work. And the closer you get to eradication using that method, probably the more likely you are to develop resistance and they'll bounce back. I think the reason that some of the genetic sort of modification techniques might work is that you're essentially using mosquitoes against each other, and that can sometimes overcome some of the problems of finding the mosquitoes, finding where they're hiding out, and also finding these sort of cryptic places where they're breeding, which is often the Achilles heel in mosquito control programs. So, perhaps with some of these new approaches, we might be able to do it given the money and resources and support from our the local communities that they're being used in.
Fingers crossed. I had one more question that's not related to mosquitoes, and it's probably not your area of expertise, Cameron, but as an entomologist, I feel I ought to ask. We've been following the disappearance of the bees and colony collapse disorder and all of that. So we're talking about DEET and everything, which made me wonder about the neonicotinoids that have been blamed for a lot of it. Do you know any more on that? Have you heard any recent news on whether or not they are linked to the bees or not?
Yeah, look, I only follow this kind of from a distance, I guess, and one of the reasons why is that these neonicotinoids are one of these different types of insecticides that sometimes may be employed to control mosquito populations where they're otherwise resistant to some other types of insecticides we're using. I mean, my understanding is that it's a complicated issue when you've got some of the impacts that are being recorded with bee populations, and trying to understand what chemicals are being used in what areas and what the exposure to bees are of these products. It's an incredibly difficult puzzle to sort of unravel. But I know that just because of this link, there's great reluctance to be using those types of insecticides in areas that where bees might be exposed to.
Mm. It's an interesting one, and I think it's also a very complicated issue too, so we won't jump into that too much. But I just thought I'd run it by you.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the problems. I mean, many years ago, maybe even a decade or so ago, there was a type of mosquito control product that was used in waterways. It was an insect growth regulator, which can be very effective in reducing the productivity of some habitats for mosquitoes. But it was starting to get linked with frog deformities. And even though that link has now been sort of debunked, it took quite some time. And one of the problems was that in some of those areas of North America where they were investigating frog deformities, there's a whole range of factors which determine the impacts on frogs. And it just so happened that the mosquito control products were an obvious target because they were sort of used directly in those types of habitats, but there was a whole suite of factors that were influencing frog populations. Sometimes getting to the bottom of these things can be incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, More research needed, as we always say on this program. I think that just about wraps it up. Dr. Cameron Webb, thank you so much for joining us. That was terrific.
Yeah, no, that's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Great to have you on. What's the best place to find you on the internet? Anything you want to plug?
Look, if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at MozzyBites, or googling Cameron Webb mosquito will turn up a whole bunch of resources, and I'm pretty easy to find, I think.
And we'll have the link to your Twitter profile on the web, as with all the other links at scienceontop.com/213. And if people want to let us know your thoughts or leave us a comment there or send us an email, feedback@scienceontop.com, or we're also on Twitter and Facebook and all of that. And as always, thank you, Shane and Penny.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
And now, there's a new threat in town, the Zika virus. And you know, the Zika virus is a lot like soccer. There's a mild curiosity in the US, but it's huge in Brazil.